In the summer of 1950, an American novelist named James Aldridge arrived at Bollingen, Jung's stone retreat on the shore of Lake Zurich, carrying a manuscript he could not finish and a question he could not answer. Aldridge had published 2 novels to considerable acclaim. His third had been anticipated by critics as the work that would establish him as a major voice in American literature. He had been working on it for 4 years. He had written over 1,000 pages, and he was, by his own account, further from completing it than on the day he had begun. Jung received him not in the consulting room but outside, in the garden where he carved stone. The old man was working on a block of granite, chipping away at it with a concentration that seemed to exclude the entire world. Aldridge waited for nearly 20 minutes before Jung set down his tools, wiped his hands, and turned to his visitor with a look that suggested he had been aware of his presence the entire time. Aldridge explained his difficulty. The novel had begun with a vision so clear and so complete that he had felt not like an author creating a work of fiction, but like a scribe recording something that already existed. The first 200 pages had come in a torrent, and they were, he believed, the best writing he had ever produced. But somewhere around the middle of the book, the vision had dimmed. The characters had stopped cooperating. The plot had developed complications he had not foreseen. He had tried to force his way through, had written and rewritten entire sections dozens of times, had thrown away hundreds of pages, had changed the ending 5 times. Nothing worked. The novel that had begun as a revelation had become a prison. He could not finish it. He could not abandon it. He could not understand what had gone wrong. Jung listened to this account with the patient attention of a man who had heard many variations of the same story. Then he did something that surprised Aldridge. He went inside the tower, returned with his deck of tarot cards, and laid the 22 major arcana on the stone table in the garden. "Show me," he said, "where you are." Aldridge looked at the cards with confusion. He was a novelist, not a mystic. But Jung waited, and eventually Aldridge began to study the images. His eyes moved across the sequence, passing the early cards without interest, slowing as he reached the middle of the sequence. He stopped at Strength, card 8. A woman holding open the jaws of a lion, not through force, but through a calm, steady, almost tender authority. Aldridge placed his finger on the card and said, "I am here, except the lion is winning." Jung smiled. It was the answer he had expected. He told Aldridge that his difficulty was not a failure of talent, discipline, or imagination. It was a predictable stage in the creative process, as predictable as the phases of the moon or the seasons of the year. Every significant creative work, Jung explained, followed the same archetypal pattern as the major arcana themselves. It began with the Fool, and, if the artist had the courage and the endurance to see it through, ended with the World. But the journey between those 2 cards was treacherous, and most creative works died somewhere in the middle, not because the artist lacked ability, but because they did not understand the psychological terrain they were crossing. Jung had been developing this understanding of creativity for decades. His own creative life, which included not only his psychological writings, but his paintings, his stone carvings, and the extraordinary illuminated manuscript known as the Red Book, had taught him that the creative process was not a skill to be mastered, but a relationship to be navigated, a relationship whose terms the artist did not get to dictate. The Fool, card 0, was where every creative act began. Jung laid the card on the table and asked Aldridge to remember the moment his novel had first come to him. Aldridge described it immediately. He had been walking along a beach in Cape Cod when an image had struck him with the force of a physical blow. A woman standing at the window of a burning house, looking not at the fire, but at the ocean. That was all. But in that single image, he had felt the entire novel, complete and waiting, like a symphony heard in a single chord. This, Jung explained, was the Fool's Leap. The moment of creative inspiration was not a rational event. It was an eruption from the unconscious, an image or a phrase or a melody that arrived uninvited, complete in itself, carrying within it the seed of an entire work. The Fool stepped off the cliff not because he had calculated the distance to the ground, but because something beyond calculation compelled him. The danger at the Fool stage, Jung noted, was not a lack of inspiration but an excess of it. The image that had struck Aldridge on the beach was not a plan for a novel. It was a seed, and seeds needed very different conditions from those required by fully grown trees. The Fool's mistake was to confuse the intensity of the initial inspiration with the quality of the finished work. This belief was the creative equivalent of the fool walking off the cliff and expecting to fly. The magician, card 1, represented the next stage, the moment when the inspired vision met the demands of conscious craft. The magician stood at his table with the 4 suits of the tarot arranged before him, the tools of his trade. In creative terms, these were the artist's acquired skills, technique, knowledge of form, mastery of medium, understanding of structure and rhythm, and the 1,000 practical decisions that transformed a raw vision into a realized work. The magician was the conscious intelligence of the artist applied to the material that the fool had provided. Jung emphasized that the magician was necessary but not sufficient. Technique without inspiration produced competent work that left no impression on the soul. He had seen this in every creative field: the technically brilliant pianist whose performances were emotionally vacant, the novelist whose sentences were flawless and whose stories were forgettable, the painter whose command of form and color was impeccable and whose canvases had nothing to say. The magician alone created craft. Only the magician in service of the fool's vision created art. But the reverse was equally true, and this was where many gifted artists failed. Inspiration without craft produced brilliant fragments, dazzling beginnings, and abandoned manuscripts. The vision arrived complete from the unconscious, but the unconscious did not speak in the language of finished novels or completed symphonies. It spoke in images, feelings, impressions, and fragments. The translation of this raw material into a completed work required the magician's skills, the patience to sit with difficult material, the discipline to work when inspiration was absent, the technical knowledge to solve problems that pure feeling could not resolve. Aldridge recognized himself in this description. He was strong on the fool's side. His inspirations were vivid, powerful, and compelling, but he had never fully developed the magician's patience. When the initial vision faded, he did not know how to continue without it. He had always relied on the torrent of inspiration to carry him through, and when the torrent slowed to a trickle, he was lost. Jung then moved to the card Aldridge had selected, Strength. This card, Jung explained, represented the central challenge of the creative process, the challenge that defeated more artists than any lack of talent ever could. The woman on the card was not killing the lion. She was not taming it into submission. She was opening its jaws, establishing a relationship with it that was neither domination nor surrender, but something more subtle and more difficult than either. The lion was the unconscious material of the creative work. It was powerful, unpredictable, and fundamentally wild. It could not be controlled by the conscious mind any more than an actual lion could be controlled by physical force. The artist who tried to force their material into the shape of their original vision, to make the lion do what they wanted, would eventually exhaust themselves in a struggle they could not win. The material had its own nature, its own logic, its own direction. This was precisely what had happened to Aldridge's novel. The characters had stopped cooperating because they had developed beyond the boundaries of his original vision. The plot had developed complications because the story was growing in ways that his conscious plan could not accommodate. The novel was not failing. It was trying to become something larger and more complex than what he had originally conceived. The lion was not rebelling, it was growing. The Strength card's teaching was that the artist had to learn to work with this growth rather than against it. This required a specific kind of courage, the courage to let the work become what it wanted to become, rather than what the artist had decided it should be. It required loosening one's grip on the original vision without abandoning it entirely, allowing the conscious plan and the unconscious material to influence each other in a dialogue that neither side fully controlled. Jung connected this to his own experience with the Red Book, the extraordinary manuscript he had worked on for 16 years and which remained unpublished during his lifetime. He told Aldridge that the Red Book had begun as an attempt to record and illustrate the visions and fantasies that had erupted from his unconscious during a period of intense psychological crisis. He had approached the work with a plan, with conscious artistic intentions, with ideas about what it should look like and what it should contain. Every conscious intention was overruled. The visions that emerged were stranger, darker, more complex, and more beautiful than anything his conscious mind could have invented. The illustrations he painted departed from every style he had trained himself in. The text that emerged was not the rational prose of a psychologist, but something closer to prophecy, a voice that was his and not his simultaneously. He had spent 16 years in a relationship with this material, and the relationship had required him to surrender his conscious control again and again without ever fully abandoning his conscious participation. He was not the author of the Red Book, he told Aldridge. He was its collaborator. The Hermit, card 9, represented another essential stage that the creative process demanded. The Hermit stood alone on a mountain, holding a lantern that cast a small circle of light in a vast darkness. This was the archetype of creative solitude, the withdrawal from the world that serious creative work required. Not the romantic solitude of the artist in his garret, but the functional solitude of a consciousness that needed to turn inward in order to hear what the unconscious was saying. Jung had observed that most creative breakthroughs occurred not in moments of social stimulation or intellectual exchange, but in moments of withdrawal. Walks taken alone, hours spent in silence, periods of apparent idleness that the outside world interpreted as laziness, but that were actually periods of intense inner listening. The Hermit's lantern was small because the light of consciousness, when applied to creative work, needed to be focused rather than diffused. The artist who tried to illuminate the entire landscape at once, who tried to see the whole work in full daylight, would be overwhelmed by its complexity. The Hermit illuminated one step at a time, trusting that the path would be revealed incrementally. Aldridge admitted that he had violated the Hermit's principles systematically. As his novel stalled, he had sought advice from editors, fellow writers, critics, and friends. He had attended literary gatherings where he discussed the book's problems in detail. He had read interviews with other novelists about their creative processes. Each piece of advice had sent him in a different direction. Each conversation had introduced a new doubt. The novel, which had originally spoken to him in a single clear voice, now spoke in a dozen conflicting voices, none of them his own. Jung was blunt. He told Aldridge that he had committed the creative equivalent of inviting strangers into the consulting room during a therapy session. The relationship between an artist and their work was as private and as delicate as the relationship between a patient and their unconscious. Outside voices, no matter how well-intentioned, disrupted the dialogue. They introduced the expectations, aesthetics, and agendas of other minds into a process that could only succeed on its own terms. The Hermit withdrew not out of arrogance but out of necessity. The inner voice could only be heard in silence. The Hanged Man, card 12, represented a stage that Aldridge had reached but not recognized. Jung explained that the Hanged Man was the archetype of creative suspension, the state in which the artist had exhausted every conscious strategy and had nothing left to do but wait, trusting that the unconscious would eventually provide what the conscious mind could not. Every artist, Jung said, reached the Hanged Man stage at some point in every significant work. It was the moment when the plot would not resolve, the chord progression would not resolve, the composition would not cohere, and no amount of conscious effort could force a solution. The natural response was panic, followed by increasingly frantic attempts to think one's way through the impasse. The Hanged Man's teaching was the opposite. Stop trying. Invert your perspective. Let gravity do what willpower cannot. Jung described how he had experienced this state repeatedly during his work on the stone carvings at Bollingen. He would work on a carving for weeks, following a conscious plan, and then reach a point where the stone refused to cooperate. The chisel would not go where he directed it. The image that was emerging bore no resemblance to what he had intended. At these moments, he had learned to stop, not to put down the tools in frustration, but to put them down in trust. He would leave the stone for days, or sometimes weeks, occupying himself with other things, knowing from decades of experience that the unconscious was working on the problem even when consciousness had abandoned it. When he returned to the stone, his hands often knew what to do before his mind did. Aldridge asked whether this meant he should simply stop writing and wait for inspiration to return. Jung shook his head. There was a difference, he said, between an artist who abandoned a work out of frustration and an artist who suspended conscious effort in order to allow unconscious processes to complete their work. The first was flight. The second was faith. Both looked, from the outside, like a man not writing. But the inner posture was entirely different, and the unconscious knew the difference even when the artist's friends did not. Jung then laid out the final sequence of cards and described the stages that followed the Hanged Man's suspension when the creative process was allowed to complete itself. After the suspension came what Jung called the creative death, the moment when the artist's original vision, the plan that had governed the work from its inception, had to die so that the work itself could live. This was the most painful stage for any creator. because it required sacrificing not a failed vision, but a beloved one. The original conception had to be released not because it was wrong, but because the work had outgrown it. For Aldridge, this meant accepting that the novel he had set out to write, the novel that had begun with the woman at the window of the burning house, was no longer the novel taking shape beneath his hands. The image remained. The woman remained. But the story around her had evolved into something richer and stranger than his original plan, and his refusal to let go of that plan was what had paralyzed him. He was trying to fit a living, growing organism into a container designed for something smaller and simpler. The container had to break. After the death of the original vision came what Jung identified as the period of gestation, the quiet interval during which the new form of the work assembled itself beneath the threshold of consciousness. This could not be hurried. The artist who rushed to fill the void left by the death of the old vision with a new conscious plan would simply repeat the cycle. The new form had to emerge on its own terms, in its own time. The artist's job during this period was to remain available, to keep the hermit's lamp lit, to maintain the strength card's relationship with the unconscious material, and to trust that what was forming in the darkness was more complete and more true than anything the conscious mind could have designed. The completion of a creative work, when it came, corresponded to the world card, the final card of the major arcana. But Jung was careful to distinguish the world of creative completion from the fantasy of creative perfection. The completed work was not a monument. It was alive. It moved. It contained tensions and contradictions that had not been resolved, but rather held in dynamic balance, the way a dance holds stillness and motion in a single gesture. A finished work of art, unlike a display of craft, carried the traces of everything that had gone into its making, including the struggles, the surrenders, and the deaths that the artist had endured along the way. Jung made one final observation that Aldridge would later describe as the single most important thing anyone had ever said to him about writing. He said that the creative process and the process of individuation were not analogous. They were identical. Every genuine creative work was a journey of self-discovery undertaken through the medium of art. The artist who completed a significant work was not the same person who had begun it. The work had changed them, just as they had changed the work. The novel that Aldridge could not finish was not merely a literary problem. It was a psychological one. The book was asking him to become someone he had not yet become, to develop capacities he had not yet developed, to see aspects of himself and the world that he had not yet been willing to see. His inability to finish the novel was not a creative block. It was a summons to growth that he had been resisting because growth required the death of the writer he had been. Aldridge left Bollingen the next morning. He did not write for 3 months. He did not discuss the novel with anyone. He walked. He read books that had nothing to do with literature. He sat in silence for long periods, doing what he later described as learning to hear. When he finally returned to the manuscript, he did something he had never done before. He began reading it not as the author who knew what it was supposed to be, but as a stranger encountering it for the first time. He read with the hermit's focused attention and the hanged man's inverted perspective, allowing the text to tell him what it was rather than telling it what it should be. What he found astonished him. The novel he had been trying to force into his original design had, despite his resistance, been growing toward something far more complex and far more honest than what he had planned. The complications he had cursed were not flaws. They were the work's intelligence asserting itself against his limitations. The characters who had stopped cooperating had actually been developing into something more real and more contradictory than the figures in his outline. The story that refused to end the way he had intended refused because it had found a better ending, one that he could not see as long as he was looking for the ending he had already decided upon. He finished the novel in 5 months. The ending was not the one he had originally envisioned, nor was it one he could have predicted. It emerged from the material itself, the way a figure emerged from stone under Jung's chisel, not because the sculptor decided what it should be, but because the stone finally showed him what it already was. The critics received it as his masterwork. Aldridge received it as something more personal, proof that the creative process, when trusted rather than controlled, knew more than the creator. Years later, in a letter to a young writer who had written to him for advice, Aldridge described the lesson of Bollingen in terms that drew directly from the tarot sequence Jung had laid out for him on the stone table. Begin as the fool. Leap before you are ready. Apply the magician's craft, but do not mistake craft for creation. When the work develops a will of its own, meet it as the woman meets the lion, firmly, gently, without the need to dominate. Withdraw into the hermit's solitude when the voices of others begin to drown the voice of the work. When you reach the point where nothing you do succeeds, hang upside down and wait. The vision you began with will have to die. Let it. What comes to replace it will be better than what you planned, because it will be true. And when the work is finally complete, you will discover that it was never really yours. You were its instrument. The best you can hope for is to have been